In 1979, Margaret Thatcher walked into 10 Downing Street and announced she was going to save Britain. She was going to modernize the economy. She was going to eliminate waste. She was going to make Britain competitive again. She had a plan, a simple plan, an elegant plan that every economist she trusted told her would work. The plan was called deindustrialization. Not officially, of course. Officially, it was called letting the market decide, removing inefficiencies, allowing creative destruction to do its work. But what it really meant was this: Britain would stop making things. Britain would stop building things. Britain would stop producing things. Instead, Britain would become a service economy, a financial economy. An economy built on moving money around rather than making products. 45 years later, entire regions of Britain are economic wastelands. Manufacturing employment has fallen by over 60%. Towns that once built ships and cars and steel now have nothing. Young people grow up with no jobs, no prospects, no future. The poverty rate in former industrial areas is higher than it was in the 1970s. Britain went from being the workshop of the world to a country that cannot even manufacture its own personal protective equipment during a pandemic. And here is the terrifying part. America is adopting the exact same policy right now, not by accident, not by coincidence, deliberately. The same think tanks, the same economic theories, the same promises, the same lies. By the time you realize what has happened, it will be too late. And if you think this does not affect you, if you think this is just about factory workers in distant states, let me tell you something. When a country stops making things, everyone suffers. Everyone. And I am going to show you exactly how. Let me take you back to Britain in the 1970s so you can see exactly how this starts. Britain in the 1970s was in trouble, real trouble. The economy was stagnant. Inflation was out of control. The unions were powerful and constantly striking. The government-owned industries were bloated and inefficient. Something needed to change. Everyone agreed on that. The debate was about what should change and how. Then came Thatcher with her answer. The problem, she said, was that Britain was trying to manufacture things it could no longer make competitively. British cars were worse than Japanese cars. British steel was more expensive than Korean steel. British shipyards were slower than Scandinavian shipyards. Why, she asked, should British taxpayers subsidize these failing industries? Why not let them collapse and allow the market to create new, better jobs? It sounded reasonable. It sounded modern. It sounded like common sense. So Britain did it. The government stopped supporting manufacturing. It stopped protecting domestic industries. It allowed factories to close by the thousands. Coal mines shut down. Steel mills went silent. Shipyards became ghost towns. Car plants moved production overseas. Entire industries that had employed millions simply vanished. But the new jobs, the better jobs, the service sector jobs that were supposed to replace manufacturing, they did not show up. Not in the numbers promised, not with the wages promised, not in the places where people actually lived. A coal miner in Yorkshire could not just become a financial analyst in London. A steel worker in Sheffield couldn't just retrain as a software developer. A shipbuilder in Glasgow couldn't just transition into consulting. The idea that markets would seamlessly reallocate labor was a fantasy. A fantasy believed by people who had never worked with their hands, who had never lived in a company town, who had never understood that jobs are not just about money, but about identity and community and purpose. What actually happened was devastation. Unemployment in former industrial regions hit 20%, then 30%. Communities that had been built around factories for generations had nothing to replace them. The social fabric disintegrated. Crime soared. Drug use exploded. Families fell apart. An entire generation grew up never seeing their parents go to work. But here is what made it permanent. Here is what made it irreversible. Once the factories closed, the supply chains disappeared. The skilled workers retired or moved away. The technical knowledge evaporated. The machinery was sold for scrap. You cannot just restart an industrial base once you have dismantled it. It takes decades to build and weeks to destroy. Britain discovered this the hard way during the COVID pandemic, when the country desperately needed ventilators and masks and protective equipment. They realized they could not make any of it. Not because they lacked engineers or money, but because the entire industrial ecosystem no longer existed. The factories were gone. The suppliers were gone. The workers were gone. Britain had to beg other countries for equipment. Britain, which invented the Industrial Revolution, was reduced to begging. That is what deindustrialization does. It does not just eliminate jobs. It eliminates capability. It eliminates sovereignty. It eliminates the ability to make your own destiny. Now let me tell you why this should make every American furious. Because America is doing the exact same thing. Right now. For the last 40 years, America has been systematically dismantling its industrial base, using the exact same logic that destroyed Britain. We were told that manufacturing was old economy. We were told that services were the future. We were told that it did not matter if we made things as long as we designed them. Every single one of those promises was a lie. Since 1980, America has lost over 7 million manufacturing jobs. Not because of automation primarily, but because of deliberate policy choices. Trade deals that made it easy to offshore production. Tax policies that rewarded companies for moving factories overseas. An exchange rate policy that made imports artificially cheap and exports artificially expensive. This was not an accident. This was policy. This was choice. Just like in Britain, we were told it did not matter. We were told that manufacturing was a small part of the economy anyway. We were told that Americans were too educated, too advanced, too sophisticated to work in factories. We were told that service jobs were better. Higher paying, more fulfilling. All lies. The average manufacturing job in America pays 25% more than the average service job. Manufacturing jobs are more likely to provide benefits, pensions, and job security. Manufacturing creates multiplier effects. For every one manufacturing job, between 3 and 5 additional jobs are created in the surrounding economy. When you close a factory, you do not just lose the factory workers. You lose the suppliers, the truckers, the restaurant workers who served them lunch, the small businesses that depended on their spending. Entire communities collapse. And just like Britain, the replacement jobs never materialized where people actually lived. A factory worker in Ohio cannot move to Silicon Valley. A machinist in Pennsylvania cannot afford to retrain as a data scientist while supporting a family. A welder in Michigan cannot just learn to code. The promise of retraining is a cruel joke. Study after study shows that displaced manufacturing workers who go through retraining programs end up earning 20 to 30% less than before. Many never find stable employment again. The idea that you can seamlessly transition an industrial workforce into a service economy is a fantasy invented by people who have never been within 100 miles of a factory floor. Let me give you some numbers that should terrify you. In 1980, manufacturing was 20% of U.S. GDP. Today it is 11% and falling. In 1980, 1 in 5 American workers was employed in manufacturing. Today, it is 1 in 12. America's trade deficit in manufactured goods is now over $1 trillion annually. Since 2000, over 65,000 American factories have closed. That is not a transition. That is a collapse. But here is the part that really matters. Here is the part that affects you even if you never worked in a factory, even if you live nowhere near a manufacturing region, even if you think this is someone else's problem. When a country stops making things, it loses the ability to innovate. Manufacturing and innovation are inseparable. You cannot design what you do not build. The knowledge of how to make things is not abstract. It is not something you can just write down in a textbook. It is embedded in the people who actually do the work. When you offshore production, you offshore learning. You offshore improvement. You offshore the future. Silicon Valley did not appear out of nowhere. It grew out of decades of manufacturing in electronics and aerospace and defense. Every major tech hub in America has roots in manufacturing. When you lose manufacturing, you lose the foundation that future innovation rests on. We are already seeing this. America invented solar panels, but we manufacture less than 5% of them. America invented lithium batteries, but we manufacture less than 10%. We invented advanced semiconductors, but we manufacture less than 15%. We keep inventing things and then watching other countries figure out how to make them efficiently, cheaply, better. Let me tell you what happened with solar panels. In the 1980s, America led the world in solar technology. But American policymakers decided that manufacturing solar panels was low-value work. So the factories moved to Asia. At first, Asian manufacturers were just following American designs. But because they were actually making the panels, they were learning how to make them better, cheaper, faster. They were innovating on manufacturing. Within 20 years, Asian manufacturers were not just making solar panels more efficiently. They were designing better panels. They were filing more patents. Today, if America wanted to build a domestic solar industry, we would have to license technology from China. We invented it. We gave away the manufacturing, and now we have to pay someone else to use our own invention. This exact pattern has repeated in industry after industry. LEDs, batteries, displays, drones. We invent it. We decide manufacturing is beneath us. We offshore production. We lose the innovation edge. We end up dependent on foreign suppliers. Britain did the exact same thing. Britain invented radar, jet engines, industrial robots, carbon fiber, the World Wide Web. But Britain decided it did not need to manufacture these things. Today, Britain does not lead in any of these fields. The innovation moved with the manufacturing. Now let me tell you the part that should make you really angry. The part about who benefits and who suffers. When America deindustrializes, the costs are borne by working-class communities, but the benefits go to a tiny elite. Corporate executives get rich by offshoring production. Their compensation is tied to stock prices, and Wall Street loves offshoring because it boosts short-term profits. Shareholders get rich from dividends funded by labor cost savings. Financial sector workers get rich from facilitating the deals that move production overseas. Wealthy consumers get cheap imported goods. Meanwhile, factory workers lose their jobs. Their communities lose their tax base. Their children lose their future. The social contract is shredded. And the people who made the decisions that caused all this suffering never face any consequences. They live in a different America. An America where the economy is measured by stock indices instead of employment, where success is defined by shareholder value instead of shared prosperity, where the destruction of communities is called economic efficiency. This is not capitalism. This is not free markets. This is a rigged system that extracts wealth from workers and communities and concentrates it in the hands of people who produce nothing. Britain's working class figured this out too late. By the time they realized what had been done to them, the factories were already gone. The supply chains were already dismantled. The damage was permanent. They voted for Brexit partly out of rage at the system that had abandoned them. But Brexit cannot bring the factories back. You cannot reverse 40 years of deindustrialization with a referendum. The industrial knowledge is gone. The workers are gone. The ecosystem is gone. America's working class is starting to figure it out now. The anger is rising. The resentment is building. But just like Britain, we are figuring it out too late. The damage is already done. And the people in power are still pushing the same policies. They are still signing trade deals that make offshoring easier. They are still prioritizing financial sector profits over manufacturing jobs. They are still telling workers that retraining is the answer. Let me tell you what makes this even worse. Deindustrialization makes a country weak, not just economically, but strategically. Britain discovered this when Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands in 1982. Britain won that war, but barely. They had to requisition civilian ships because they did not have enough naval transport. They had to jury-rig weapons systems because they did not have enough equipment. They won because Argentina was even less capable, not because Britain was strong. Today, Britain could not fight that war. They do not have the ships. They do not have the manufacturing base to build more quickly. They do not have the industrial capacity to sustain a conflict. They are dependent on allies for everything. America is heading down the same path. We cannot manufacture enough ammunition to supply Ukraine without depleting our own stocks. We cannot build ships fast enough to keep pace with China. We are dependent on Taiwan for the semiconductors that go into every weapon system we have. If there is a conflict with China over Taiwan, we would be cut off from the supply chain we need to fight the war. This is insane. A country that cannot make things cannot defend itself. A country that depends on potential adversaries for critical supplies is not sovereign. Now let me tell you about the specific policy that drove all this. The policy that Britain adopted and America copied. The policy that sounds so reasonable and has been so catastrophic. It is called comparative advantage. You have probably heard of it. It is one of the most basic concepts in economics. The idea is simple. Countries should specialize in what they are best at and trade for everything else. If Britain is better at finance and China is better at manufacturing, both countries benefit if Britain does finance and China does manufacturing. Everyone gets richer through trade, except it does not work that way in the real world. Comparative advantage assumes that capital and labor cannot move between countries. In the real world, they can and do. Comparative advantage assumes that trade is balanced. In the real world, it is not. Comparative advantage assumes that losing industries will be automatically replaced by new ones. In the real world, they are not. Comparative advantage assumes that short-term efficiency is the only thing that matters. In the real world, resilience and sovereignty matter too. Most importantly, comparative advantage ignores the fact that what you are good at is not fixed, it is learned. Britain was good at shipbuilding because Britain built ships for centuries. When Britain stopped building ships, that advantage disappeared. It did not come back. Korea became good at shipbuilding by building ships even when it was not efficient. Now, Korea has the advantage. China was not good at manufacturing high-tech goods in 1990. China became good at it by doing it, by protecting infant industries, by requiring technology transfer, by subsidizing strategic sectors, by ignoring the rules of comparative advantage. Now China has the advantage in dozens of industries. America used to understand this. Alexander Hamilton's entire economic policy was based on rejecting comparative advantage. He knew that America needed to develop manufacturing even though Britain could make things more efficiently. He imposed tariffs to protect American industry. That policy worked. America went from an agricultural backwater to the world's leading industrial power in less than a century. Then, we forgot the lesson. We started believing that markets alone would create optimal outcomes. We started treating comparative advantage as an iron law instead of a flawed theory. Let me tell you what happens in the final stage of deindustrialization. The stage Britain is in now. The stage America is entering. Once the industrial base is gone, the economy becomes fragile. A country that makes nothing is vulnerable to every shock. When COVID hit, Britain could not make ventilators or protective equipment. When energy prices spiked, Britain had no domestic production to fall back on. When supply chains broke down, Britain had nothing to substitute. The economy lurches from crisis to crisis with no resilience and no options. The government tries to compensate by borrowing and spending. But without a productive economy generating real wealth, the borrowing just creates inflation and debt. The standard of living declines. The currency weakens. The country becomes visibly, undeniably poorer. Britain's GDP per capita has fallen behind not just Germany and France, but Poland and Slovenia. Countries that were behind the Iron Curtain 30 years ago are now richer than Britain. That is what deindustrialization does. It does not just make you weaker, it makes you poorer. Absolutely, permanently poorer. And the worst part is that there is no easy way back. You cannot just decide to reindustrialize. The workers need to be trained, which takes years. The supply chains need to be rebuilt, which takes decades. The factories need to be constructed, which requires capital that no longer exists domestically. Other countries that do have manufacturing capacity are not going to give up their advantages easily. They will subsidize their industries. They will dump products to prevent competitors from emerging. They will use every tool available to maintain their position. Reindustrializing against that opposition is incredibly difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. It requires national commitment. It requires patience. It requires accepting short-term costs for long-term gain. Britain has not been willing to make that commitment. Every government talks about rebuilding manufacturing, but none actually does it. Because it would require telling voters that things will get worse before they get better. It would require telling corporations that they cannot just chase the lowest labor costs anymore. It would require telling the financial sector that the economy will no longer be run for their benefit. No British politician has been willing to say those things, so Britain keeps declining, keeps getting poorer, keeps becoming more dependent. America is at a crossroads right now. We are not as far gone as Britain. We still have some manufacturing capacity. We still have some industrial knowledge. We still have time to change course. But that window is closing rapidly. Every factory that closes takes knowledge with it. Every year that passes, more skilled workers retire. Every trade deal we sign makes it harder to rebuild. The policymakers who drove deindustrialization are still in power. They are still in the State Department, still in the Treasury, still in the economics departments of prestigious universities, still in corporate boardrooms, still in think tanks. They still believe that offshoring is efficient. They still believe that services can replace manufacturing. They still believe that trade deficits do not matter. They still believe that what happened to Britain cannot happen to America. They are wrong, dead wrong. And by the time they admit it, it will be too late. Let me tell you who understands this. China understands this. China watched what happened to Britain. China watched what happened to America's Rust Belt. China learned the lesson. China knows that a nation that does not make things is a weak nation. So China does the opposite of everything the free market economists recommend. China subsidizes manufacturing even when it is not profitable. China protects domestic industries even when foreign competitors are cheaper. China forces technology transfer. China manipulates its currency to make exports competitive. China builds overcapacity deliberately to drive foreign competitors out of business. Every single one of these policies violates the rules of free trade, and every single one of them works. China has gone from making cheap toys to making 80% of the world's solar panels, 70% of the world's smartphones, 60% of the world's steel. China now has the largest shipbuilding industry in the world, the largest electric vehicle industry, the largest battery industry. China is not just manufacturing. China is innovating, filing more patents than America in key technologies, leading in 5G, in artificial intelligence, in quantum computing. This happened because China rejected the policy of deindustrialization. China chose sovereignty over efficiency. China chose the long term over the short term. And now China is reaping the benefits while America and Britain live with the consequences. Here is what I need you to understand. This is not just about economics. This is not just about jobs. This is about power. Manufacturing is power. The country that makes things is the country that sets the rules. For 200 years, the West made things, so the West set the rules. We decided what the international order looked like. We decided how trade worked. We decided which countries succeeded and which failed. We had that power because we had factories, because we could produce more than anyone else, because other countries needed what we made. That era is ending. Not because it had to end, but because we chose to end it. We chose to offshore our power. We chose to make ourselves dependent. We chose to hollow out our own strength. Britain did the same thing. Britain chose finance over manufacturing, chose the City of London over the Midlands and the North, chose short-term profits over long-term strength, and Britain paid the price. Britain is no longer a great power. Britain is a medium-sized country with delusions of grandeur. A country that cannot make its own steel, or build its own ships, or supply its own energy. A country entirely dependent on the goodwill of others. That is America's future if we stay on this path. 30 years from now, America could be a hollow shell. Rich in some cities, destitute in others. Dependent on China for technology. Dependent on other countries for goods. Unable to project power because we lack the industrial base to sustain it. The tragedy is that this is preventable. We know what the problem is. We know what the solution is. We need to bring manufacturing back. We need to protect strategic industries. We need to subsidize critical sectors. We need to accept that efficiency is not the only value that matters. We need policies that prioritize workers over shareholders, communities over corporations, the long term over the short term. Other countries have done this. Germany never deindustrialized. Germany protected its manufacturing base. Today, Germany is the strongest economy in Europe. Japan never deindustrialized. Today, Japan is still a technological leader. South Korea industrialized deliberately through government policy. Today, South Korea leads in shipbuilding, electronics, and automobiles. It can be done, but it requires rejecting the ideology that hollowed out Britain, the ideology that is hollowing out America, the ideology that says markets always know best, that governments should never interfere, that trade is always good, that manufacturing does not matter. Every word of that ideology is a lie. Markets do not always know best. Markets optimize for short-term profit, not long-term resilience. Markets do not care if your country can defend itself. Markets do not care if entire regions become wastelands. Governments should interfere. Every successful industrial economy in history was built with government support. Trade is not always good. Trade that hollows out your industrial base is bad. Trade that makes you dependent on rivals is bad. Manufacturing does matter. It matters more than almost anything else. It is the foundation of prosperity, of innovation, of power. Britain forgot that. America is forgetting it, and we are both paying the price. I am making this video because I want you to see what is happening. I want you to understand that the decline of American manufacturing is not an accident. It is not inevitable. It is the result of policy choices, choices that were made by people who believed a theory more than they believed in America, choices that benefited a few at the expense of the many, choices that are still being made right now, today, as more factories close and more jobs disappear. You need to know this. You need to understand this because the future of this country depends on whether enough people figure it out in time. Britain did not figure it out in time. The factories closed, the communities died, the knowledge disappeared. And now Britain is stuck, unable to compete, unable to rebuild, unable to escape the consequences of decades of bad decisions. America still has a chance. But we are running out of time. The industrial base is shrinking every year. The knowledge is disappearing as workers retire. The supply chains are moving permanently overseas. If we wait another decade, it will be too late. The policy that hollowed out Britain is hollowing out America. And unless we reject that policy completely and urgently, we will end up exactly where Britain is now. Diminished, dependent, declining. That is not the future I want for this country. That is not the future you should accept. We need to demand better. We need to demand leaders who understand that manufacturing matters, who understand that a country that makes nothing is a country with no future, who are willing to make the hard choices to rebuild what we have lost. This is not about nostalgia. This is not about going back to some imaginary past. This is about survival. This is about whether America will be a strong, sovereign, prosperous nation 50 years from now, or a cautionary tale that other countries study to avoid our mistakes. The choice is ours, but we need to make it soon, because the clock is ticking. The factories are closing, and history is watching to see if we are smart enough to learn from Britain's mistakes or doomed to repeat them.